Elon Musk drops more Twitter files on his chosen journalists. Exposing some internal conversations about content moderation, Musk hopes to show Twitter's former managers curbed freedom of speech for political gain. But Musk's critics say that is exactly what he's doing now. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Twitter files. Well, ever since Elon Musk's October Twitter takeover, the world's richest man has sparked nothing but controversy. Acquiring billions of dollars in debt to gain control of one of the biggest social media platforms, the self-declared free speech absolutist is now himself being accused of controlling what's said on the platform. Last week, Musk launched the Twitter files, which he says exposes how previous management censored content according to political bias. Now, ex-Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey insists there was no ill intent or hidden agenda, but Musk seems to think otherwise. Here's a look now at the Twitter files.
The Pentagon Papers, the Panama Papers, the Watergate scandal, the Plame affair. Each the result of months of work by teams of journalists, or of whistleblowers putting everything on the line. But not the Twitter files. This is a different kind of leak. So what are the Twitter files? The Twitter files is a set of internal documents shared by Elon Musk with selected journalists to expose how Twitter operated under previous management. It's designed to expose the role the platform played in previous cultural and political events. The new Twitter CEO announced the leak himself.
The Twitter files on free speech suppression, soon to be published on Twitter itself. The public deserves to know what really happened.
Who are the journos? The chosen ones, Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, and Michael Schellenberger, were given broad access to the media giant's files. They then shared what they found in lengthy Twitter threads rather than on their own platforms. Taibbi's first contribution was on the New York Post's Hunter Biden laptop story, including Twitter's decision to suspend the newspaper's account and to block users from sharing its article, a decision later acknowledged to be a mistake. A second thread from him was on moderation discussions in the weeks leading up to the January 6th Capitol attack. Weiss's part in the saga is different. Rather than focusing on US electoral politics, her thread takes a more systemic look at Twitter's moderation practices. She focuses on what she calls Twitter's secret blacklists, publishing screenshots of the moderation pages for some of the site's most notorious users. She shows how Twitter used so-called visibility filtering. This is a form of moderation that is intended to impact freedom of reach without affecting freedom of speech. So why does it matter? For many, the response to the Twitter files has been more revealing than the actual content. Musk set the agenda of the whole exercise to show old Twitter to be a hotbed of left-wing bias, explicitly aligned with the US Democratic Party, taking unwarranted action to censor speech. But so far, the posts haven't really shown that. Instead, they give us an insight into the sorts of discussion that were likely happening behind closed doors at the time. What's the reaction been? Well, on the right, the Twitter files are being held up as proof that Twitter took deliberate actions to limit access to information and voices that could damage the Democrats. The left appears to be dismissing the files as much ado about nothing, or at least about things that Twitter had disclosed years ago. And who's in the middle? For most users, more interested in the World Cup, their view of the Twitter files may be determined by whichever take is shared most in their particular echo chamber.
So, what will the public get out of the Twitter files? Joining me now to debate that and more are from Washington, Senior Fellow at the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institute, Darrell West. And from London, we have Julia Hornle. She is the Internet Law Chair at Queen Mary University's Center for Commercial Law Studies. Thanks both so much for being with us. Darrell, as you know, one problem with these Twitter files is that information is being selectively released. Elon Musk isn't just putting it all out there, which means the information and the message it sends is actually being controlled. That's exactly what freedom of speech is not, correct?
That's exactly correct. I have no problem with him putting out information, but it is the selective use of the information that is really problematic. I mean, all the social media firms are engaging in content moderation, kind of pulling down posts that incite violence or engage in hate speech of varying sorts. So I think it's important for the public to understand how these companies are making their decisions, on what basis they're making the decisions, what factors are going into it. But the fact that he has only put out information that seems to be designed to embarrass liberals is very problematic, because we don't know if the same thing is happening on the conservative side. So I would personally like him to see him put out all the files so we could see how they engaged in content moderation.
Okay. But I mean, Shaun, I'll stick with, sorry, Darrell, I'll stick with you for a minute. What do you think these Twitter files really even reveal here? You know, we've been hearing so far there's no so-called smoking gun. So what does Musk think he's going to get from this?
I mean, what the files reveal are basically the inside Twitter conversations that people were having about possibly problematic posts. Like, you know, if somebody engages in something that is inciting violence or is hateful in some respect, then the company would have to decide whether they were going to take it down. And so there were internal conversations about how to do that, what factors to introduce in making those types of decisions, where you draw the line. Like, all that is perfectly reasonable. Like, any news organization has internal conversations like that. So it would be useful if we actually saw all the files so we could see whether Twitter was censoring liberals, moderates, or conservatives, or, you know, exactly on what basis they were making these decisions. The problem is he just put out a very small number of posts and basically is alleging that there was a long-term liberal bias at Twitter. We don't know that because we don't have access to all the information.
Fair enough. Julia, you know, on that, having access to the information, people have complained, as Darrell was, about kind of a lack of transparency into how these decisions have been made, who's chosen to be censored or banned from the platform. But from the legal perspective, these, we have to remember, are privately owned companies. So what really is their legal obligation to expose or not expose what they deem, what Elon Musk in this case feels he wants the public to know?
I think there are no clear legal rules as such. I mean, it's a private space, it's just largely governed by Twitter's terms and conditions, and they will obviously moderate content according to their rules, which they publish in their terms and conditions. So obviously, if someone publishes hate speech or misinformation, some action will be taken, but that is well known, and you only have to look at the terms and conditions of Twitter to be aware that that is happening. I mean, are we saying that content moderation shouldn't happen at all? But even if there was no content moderation, that doesn't mean that everyone's tweet would get the same visibility, because as we know, this is all automated. It's all governed by the algorithms, which is the piece of code which decides which piece of content is pushed. And that's essentially a commercial system, right? It's trying to engage people more and more so that obviously Twitter gets more and more volume of conversation. That is not a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's tweet will get the same visibility.
Right.
So I think that the debate about freedom of speech is slightly misguided. It's sort of almost as though Twitter is suppressing information by engaging in content moderation, when that is not necessarily the case. So all the platforms have to engage in content moderation.
Okay, but I mean, still, at the same time, you also see a very clear political agenda here for Elon Musk, correct?
Yes, correct. So he is using hyperbole by talking about the Twitter files as though he's engaged in a major revelation, when he hasn't. He basically showed the files to journalists, who then selectively picked examples where right-wing views have perhaps been suppressed or have been less visible. But there was no examination whether the same happened to left-wing views, for example. And they also cherry-picked just a few examples. But what does that really tell? It almost tells nothing.
Right. I mean, so Darrell, you know, another issue here is that content moderators, that they are not perfect human beings. They're, I guess, trying to objectively determine right from wrong. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. But Do you think the Twitter files will show any deliberate or even malicious effort to actually block the truth?
I mean, so far, I've not seen any evidence of that type of action. I mean, what I am seeing is just human beings trying to grapple with where you draw the line. We want to encourage freedom of speech on the one hand and have a wide range of views that are represented out there. But we also know there's a lot of disinformation, there's misinformation, there are things that are just completely detrimental to social justice in any particular society. So what we have to do is to kind of respect the fact that there were individuals grappling with those types of very complicated decisions. There aren't clear-cut rules governing this. Twitter is privately owned, so technically Elon Musk could actually censor whoever he wants, and there's no legal recourse. But these social media firms have so much influence that all the rest of us want to make sure they're engaging in fair decisions, that there's no evidence of a systematic political bias. But there's nothing that has come out so far that actually substantiates Musk's claim that there was a systematic liberal bias at Twitter.
Right. Do you think, Darrell, that people will respect that these are just people trying to do their jobs and they can be flawed? Because, what we're hearing from so much of the media now are points being made about Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, for example, his tweets slamming Israel. He called Israel a malignant, cancerous tumor in the West Asian region that has to be removed and eradicated, that he was allowed to continue on the platform while Trump was banned.
Yeah, and those are exactly the types of questions that are quite legitimate. And we actually should be having those discussions about, what is freedom of speech, where we draw the lines, what's hurtful, what's harmful, what deserves greater visibility in terms of the algorithms pushing tweets by certain individuals and not pushing tweets by other individuals. The problem I have is, up to this point, there's been very little transparency on the part of any of these companies, Twitter, Facebook, or Google, in terms of how they are making those decisions. So I think the interesting thing about the Twitter files is we've gotten our first glimpse into how they are starting to make those decisions. But because it's such a small and selective release of information, it doesn't really answer the basic question of whether there is a bias. So I'd like to see a lot more information out there just so we can understand how content moderation is taking place.
Okay. At this point, I'm able to welcome, actually, our third panelist. Darrell, you'll notice that I accidentally called you Shaun earlier on because we had Shaun and then lost his connection, but he joins us now from Washington. Shaun Waterman, he's a journalist covering cybersecurity for Newsweek magazine. Shaun, great to have you. Thanks for being able to join. Well, why don't you tell me if you think Musk, by doing what he's done via these Twitter files, is actually getting what he hoped for, or is it backfiring?
Well, it's a sort of Rorschach test, isn't it? That's the problem. Conservatives look at these documents that have been released and they see proof of this huge liberal conspiracy. But others look at it and they see a nothing burger, as it's been described. So it sort of depends on who your audience is. He's certainly fired up supporters and conservatives online.
Okay. And speaking of, sorry, Julia, go ahead. I could see you actually had a comment earlier. Go ahead.
But I think the problem always is, isn't it, that people demand freedom of speech, but they demand freedom of speech only for their viewpoint. And that, to my mind, is not about freedom of speech. And that's exactly, I think, what is happening here, that you say, okay, look, our speech is being suppressed, right-wing speech is being suppressed, but there's not even an examination whether the same has happened to other types of left-wing or liberal speech. So actually, it's very similar to what we've seen earlier when the American rights have sort of focused on traditional media outlets and calling them fake news. It's exactly the same phenomenon, basically crying murder when the views of others don't fit your own ideology. And that, to my mind, is not transparency. You either disclose everything or nothing, right?
Right. And Darrell, that kind of leads to the question as to why this story has saturated right-wing news outlets like Fox News and the New York Post, while others have only kind of just mentioned it as a story. Do you think this leak is exclusively for like-minded people when Musk had actually hoped it would be about exposing censorship for political gain?
I mean, Musk has a big problem here in the sense that he paid $44 billion for Twitter, which is way over what the company actually is worth. So he is losing money on this investment already. He has $1 billion in debt payments he has to pay each year. There's a lot of advertisers. 90% of the Twitter revenue comes from ads. There are a lot of advertisers that have paused or stopped their advertising on that platform. And so what I think Musk keeps trying to do is just to generate interest, even if it is contentiousness and controversy, just in hopes that he can draw the advertisers back because there is a big audience there. But he is becoming his own worst enemy because he's just trolling opponents, acting in very partisan ways. He's doing very little to reassure the fears either of the users or the advertisers that his platform is a reasonable platform. So, he is, in everything he's doing, he's actually destroying the Twitter brand.
Right. Shaun, would you agree there? I mean, is this kind of a weird, convoluted way for Elon Musk to try to get Twitter some attention, be it positive or negative, and hopefully get some revenue stream back?
Well, I'm afraid I don't think he's thought it through that well, Andrea. I mean, it's a dumpster fire, isn't it? What he's done by sort of doubling down on the rhetoric that he's been using. I mean, the former head of trust and safety at Twitter had to leave his home at the weekend because of all the death threats he was getting as a result of Elon Musk, on completely unwarranted, insinuating that he was some sort of groomer trying to, promote sex with minors. Just unbelievable stuff, and really not the kind of behavior you want to see from someone at the head of a really important company like Twitter, that's a big part of our public discourse now. And frankly, Mr. Musk borrowed quite a lot of money to buy this company, and it's time for some of the people that lent him that money to step up and start being the grown-ups in the room and telling him he's got to,
unfortunately,
start knuckling down to the business of really running the company and trying to make money.
Okay. Shaun, Julia, let me cross back to you quickly because, some of what Shaun was addressing there also leads to the potential for some pretty serious litigation. And that could factor into the financial equation here as well. There's also the question from a legal perspective of these private conversations being exposed. I don't know what the legal ramifications for that could be, but could he legally face some pretty serious lawsuits? One for what Shaun was referring to about potentially putting people's lives at risk, and then secondly, for just exposing what should have been private conversations and admitting as much.
Yeah, there are huge questions here, I guess, about privacy and confidentiality. And as you say, it's a form of, if things are being disclosed which are putting people's lives at risk, as we've seen with the head of trust and safety, then, hopefully nothing worse will happen, but it could happen. So that could lead to all sorts of litigation further down the line. We've also seen, the litigation in relation to Facebook and the Rohingya in Myanmar, and the allegations being that Facebook actually was negligent in preventing the incitement of the genocide on its own platform. So I think platforms are now increasingly being put in a fire of litigation for both their content moderation or the lack of content moderation, which in my mind means that we need more governance in this area so that there is more clarity both for the platforms as well as for the public as to their obligations. In the UK, I guess we're currently seeing a new piece of legislation, the Online Safety Bill, which would include these types of governance standards, but then obviously we have a form of government regulation, which I'm sure in the US wouldn't be, still at this point, not acceptable.
Yeah.
But I think it's the only way forward. In particular, I think we need much clearer standards as to the transparency of content moderation. So content moderation is increasingly automated by AI, and of course all this is a sort of technology which is not in the public domain. But in order to have that public debate, I think we need independent verification and testing of these types of technologies so the public actually knows how content moderation works.
Yeah.
And this is not specific to Twitter, that's all the platforms, right?
Interesting too, Julie, I mean, just there was a note on all of this that with the AI and the algorithms at work here, there were reports that were showing that the algorithms were actually initially working more in favor of right-wing views, and it was the Content and Moderation Council that was trying to get that better under control and give it some more balance. So interesting to hear complaints about, you know, favoring one side when the algorithms actually were favoring the other, if that is indeed the case. But Darrell, let me come back to you. Go ahead. Go ahead, Julia.
In 2021, there was a study by Twitter which showed that right-wing views gained greater traction through Twitter's algorithms. I don't think this was intentional. This is just the sheer chance. It's also obviously dependent on the kind of engagement, and maybe right-wing populist views are more engaging users than liberal or left-wing views. So it's not just the algorithms. It's a mix of the algorithms and the engagement of users. But that 2021 study showed that left-wing views have been less engaged with than right-wing views, interestingly enough, I think.
You know, Darrell, while Elon Musk may want to get more exposure for his and his followers' right-wing views, isn't he just, and Julia, I think, alluded to this, isn't he just really broadening the left-right divide that was already in the US rather than actually winning over new followers?
Absolutely. I mean, Musk has been pouring gasoline on a fire that already is raging, but he's making it a lot worse. You know, he's being so partisan and ideological in how he's running the company that he's enraging people who have other points of view by accusing liberals of bias without really providing much evidence to back up his claims. He's aggravating his opponents, and you know, the company actually does face some very serious legal liability from all of these controversies. Like the European Union is looking into this in terms of possible violations of their regulations. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission had signed a consent agreement with Twitter many years ago where Twitter promised to protect the privacy of the users. There is the possibility the various things that Musk has been doing violates that FTC agreement. And so he could face huge fines as a result of this. The fact that he's laid off so many people without providing a 60-day notice, which is required in a number of different states, means he's going to have lawsuits from those fired employees. So, you know, for a guy who wants to build the business and attract attention, you know, the legal liability is actually quite substantial and actually could endanger the entire company.
Yeah. And just quickly, Shaun, you know, we were seeing a lot of pictures there of Hunter Biden, and I hadn't really raised it in this debate. We explained some of it in our package. But that was one of the big bugbears for Elon Musk, saying that that whole affair was covered up by the former Twitter management, and that's really what was, you know, the crux of this freedom of speech issue. I mean, do you see that as something that the public actually wanted to know about, and that it is kind of fundamental for how they see the Twitter files?
Well, there's a certain amount of prurient interest in the Hunter Biden story, of course, because of his, you know, descent into the drug-fueled chaos. But I think that just to broaden the aperture for a moment, you know, this fits a sort of victimology that conservatives have about themselves. You know, that they're sort of being shadow banned when, you know, Twitter's terms of service have for years said that they will reduce the visibility of certain of certain accounts, and you know, been quite straightforward about it. So I think that one thing we've got to watch is that the reporters who have been releasing this are not part of a news organisation, okay? They're out on Substack on their own. There's no checks and balances. There's very little context to anything that they've revealed. Often they've neglected or even misrepresented important facts about the context and history of these issues, which, these debates have been going on for a very long time. So,
okay. Yep, Shaun, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt it there because we're actually over time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd really like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.